Hello and welcome. My name is James Pawelski. I'm Professor of Practice and Director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project in the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. The Humanities and Human Flourishing Project seeks to explore connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being. As a part of this project, we brought together groups of scholars across 8 different disciplines in the arts and humanities, including my own discipline of philosophy, to explore connections between the conceptualization and the cultivation of well-being. Each of these groups was headed by a disciplinary chair who helped us bring together a diverse set of scholars and then edited a volume of essays that we created. I'm pleased to be joined by Timothy Corrigan, who is Professor of Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and was the disciplinary chair for the group on Cinema and Media Studies. Timothy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure.
So Timothy, I wonder if we could start on a personal note. Could you tell us about a time when your engagement in cinema helped improve your well-being?
I mean, do you want a recent example?
Yeah, I would love one. Yeah.
A recent example is we have the privilege at Penn of taking 30 students to the Cannes Film Festival every year. And it's a complicated experience because it's so French, so excessive, et cetera, et cetera. But there's always these gems that just transform you in a way. And at this last one, there was a French-Moroccan film, first feature by a woman director named Marianne Touzani. It's called Adam. And I knew nothing about it. And I went in there, and this was, one of these amazing experiences. I thought, this is the most beautiful film about 2 women in Morocco that I've seen in years. And in many ways, that's the sort of magic for me of film, is you go into a lot of films which are hyped or not hyped, and one's disappointed or very disappointed, but there's always around the corner something that you say, this has changed me in a way.
So moving out from your own experience to your discipline as a whole, what would you say are some of the ways in which cinema can teach us things about well-being?
Yeah, I'm sure that there's many answers to this. In part, as a product of this amazing few days we had together talking with other scholars in other fields, I've kind of refined and rethought how I'm thinking about it. And the word that has come to the foreground in terms of what I think is most amazing and important about film and, to a certain extent, new media is this word that Marty Seligman uses, which is agency. And I think that for various reasons, cinema, film, movies, new media, they offer access for individuals, for students, for public, into a really dynamic sense of their own agency. And I can sort of refine that point a bit more if you want, but I think that there's something about film, and I don't mean to be in combat with other disciplines or performing arts, which also have their own stake in this, but I think there's something about film which provides a really dynamic sense of agency, which is, for me, in many ways, the platform for well-being, for flourishing, when you know that you're, in a sense, in charge, or at least theoretically in charge. That's the beginning of happiness.
So let's talk more about this, an agency, because I could imagine someone saying, Timothy, look, what are you talking about agency with a movie? Like, you're completely passive, the movie has been shot long before you're watching it, you're just a spectator. So how is that agency?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because, traditionally, in terms of film theory and film scholarship, there's been this examination of, well, we're passive spectators, we're passive viewers. I don't agree with that at all. And in a sense, I think most scholarship in film and media studies has kind of debunked that. Yeah, we're in traditional situations, we're sitting in the dark, watching images as if we were a voyeur. That, of course, is less and less the case because of new media, streaming, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in a way, it's in some ways a bigger issue in a way. There's a sense in which, if I could just sort of isolate a few points about this, is film sort of intersects what I would call sort of the classical arts and, in many ways, the popular cultures of today. And most people, I think, find themselves, in one sense or another, between these two. But what that offers is a kind of confidence in terms of your pleasure principles, your knowledge about who the stars are, what's happening, and so forth, which, if you're reading 19th century literature, excuse me, literature people, but, you don't necessarily have that confidence in some ways of negotiating your own pleasure or criticism across that in many ways. So that's one place I think it comes into play. The other is, I think, technologically, and there are several others as well, I would say, but technologically, of the performing arts, I dare say that film, new media, and so forth are so embedded in technology. And whether you're a casual fan of these technologies or a very serious ones, they provide a kind of, I'd say, again, confidence or accessibility or knowledge about how our world, in many ways, is a product of different sort of technological perspectives and so forth. I think the traditional view, to a certain extent, is that we are dominated by the technologies that run our lives. That's the kind of hypercritical one. And I think in this day particularly, that's not the case. I think there's a sense in which people who engage these technologies through film, through streaming, through new media, they are provided with a kind of confidence and accessibility and mobility in many ways in terms of how they approach technology, not as some sort of powerful tool that dominates them, but as something that they have access to as agents of that. The last thing I'd mention, which is in some ways the first thing I should mention, is film travels the world. And it travels the world in so many miraculous ways. I mean, it's true that for most individuals, we are like locked into Hollywood cinema. We may be even locked into the films of the last 10 or 20 years. Yet nonetheless, I think, even within those parameters, but certainly in the broader sense of film and cultural history, movies allow you to go places and be things and be people through different modes of identification. And that's exhilarating, I think.
So are there ways that you would suggest approaching these technologies that help to optimize human flourishing?
One particularly, and this comes back to what I do. It comes back to pedagogy, which I think is key to everything in life. Maybe that's because it's what I do, but it's providing a kind of self-consciousness about that, so that everyone loves the movies. Well, I think everyone loves the movies, but everyone who loves the movies or goes to the movies all know about what they like and what's good or bad, and that's a really strong starting point, because you're not in some ways talking down to somebody from that position. But what I think you can build on from that position is, well, let's think about it. Let's talk about it. Let's examine, in some ways, your perspectives, your likes, your dislikes. And, that becomes a kind of pedagogical moment. It becomes a place where film sort of shifts into those old classical moments of the only life worth living is a reflective life. I think the most productive and, in some ways, generative ways to talk about film culture, new media culture, is by, in some ways, drawing out those reflective moments.
So, Timothy, what was it about the Humanities and Human Flourishing project that initially interested you?
You.
You're very kind.
No, you drew me into it, but both personally and intellectually. But, our original conversation was this, that I've always been interested in of value in movies. And that's a term that runs, back to 1895 in the beginning of movies. Are movies degenerative? Are they valuable? Do they corrupt our children? Should women be going to the movies? What is the value of movies? Are they economically valuable? Are they culturally valuable? So value is a term that has sort of spread itself through the last 130 years of films. And I realized that, as we talked and as I thought about it, this question of value is very much engaged with this question of well-being and flourishing on a slightly different, more specific level. I mean, it's not really about economic value, and it's not necessarily about, political value, possibly. But, I realized that this was something that was embedded in this notion of value. I also realized at the same time that whenever I teach a large class, and it may not have a single film studies person in it, it may not have a single person interested in movies in it. It may be a nursing student who's not seen a movie since 2010. But I always teach movies to this group as something that's really significantly central to their lives. Not necessarily in terms of how to be a better nurse or how to be a better investment banker, but really how to think about the culture in which they live and think both critically and immersively about it. To examine your pleasures, to think about what in some ways influences your life. Where are the points of identification that in some ways help describe your own identity and so forth. So in a way, both pedagogically but also as a scholar, I realized that this project on well-being and flourishing really did dovetail with things which were circulating in my own brain at the time.
So Timothy, you've talked about cinema as being something that is widely accessible. Let's talk about flourishing. Is flourishing something that is only for the privileged? You have to have a certain socioeconomic status, you have to have a certain family background perhaps, and if you don't have all these other things going for you, then flourishing isn't really of interest?
Well, I mean, I would disagree with that. I mean, I do see that argument, and, we've all heard it from various quarters that, it's about, people with money or privilege can flourish, people without cannot. I come from a working class background, and I don't think it's in some ways that pigeonholed in terms of our experience. I think that, if I can sort of stay within my own discipline here, I think that there are ways in which, whatever your walk in life, whatever your situation, there are moments with encounters with films that in many ways become moments of transformation or moments of acceptance, moments of well-being, and even moments of flourishing. In the piece I wrote for the volume, I, somewhat without adequate expertise, tried to make a distinction between, well-being and flourishing. And I saw well-being as a kind of acceptance situation, an acceptance that is really quite dynamic in a way about this is my life and I love it, versus flourishing, which in my particular argument is about a kind of active, I'm going to find it in a way. And I think people find well-being certainly through the movies in a variety of ways from a variety of different positions. One of the films that I talk about is this 1941 film, Sullivan's Travels, which gets remade in 2000 by the Coens as Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And it's a wonderful sort of parable because it's about a Hollywood director who decides he's been making all of these kind of silly comedies for Hollywood against a background of a post-Depression era in America. And it troubles him. It troubles him. He said, we should reach out to these people who don't have experiences of well-being or flourishing and try and engage them. And through a very complicated road movie, which is spectacular. He has this moment, this epiphany moment, when he is, and I won't bore you with the whole plot, finds himself with a group of prisoners who are watching a silly comedy. And he's looking around and he says, this is invigorating these guys in a way that I never realized. And it becomes a moment where it's really not about where you're coming from, but in some ways where you can find those moments of well-being or flourishing.
Let's talk about new media for a moment. Are there ways in which new media can support flourishing, or ways in which it can be an obstacle to flourishing? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the simple answer for me in terms of my bigger point about people who engage film and new media, who experience it, who know it, or who might know it a little bit, that it provides a kind of confidence about their own agency in pursuing what they want. And there's nothing in some ways that more dramatizes that than new media these days. Because, as I say to my students, you have better cameras in your pocket than they had during the French New Wave. And students, individuals, there's a kind of mobility, which is, I think, key in terms of what film and new media offer, kind of mobility that's everywhere. It's everywhere. And that's good theoretically. The danger with new media for me is that it can drift into this domain of what I've called digital narcissism, where it's simply about me or my Facebook pals or whomever. That seems to me to be, borderline pathological. People would disagree with me, but especially since I feel, in a sense, that whether we're talking about film or new media, the dynamics of it, the most productive dynamics of it, are about using it as access to the other. Finding one's agency in some ways confronted by the other out there, whether it's a different culture, a different gender, whatever. And there's a tendency in new media to say, it's all about me. And that troubles me much. So I think new media is in a really complicated but really fascinating moment where it's trying to negotiate between the kind of possibilities, social, psychological, political, for new media and its tendency to drift into a kind of digital narcissism.
So, Timothy, the final question I'll ask is, when you think about this project, the Humanities and Human Flourishing, the meeting that you've had with these scholars in your discipline, and the volume that you've put together, what are your hopes? How do you hope that this might change your discipline and perhaps your students in the world?
What I would hope is that it really draws to the front. Because as I said before, I think it's, these questions of value, have been there forever and ever in terms of film history. Usually they're sort of pinpointed at, how are movies valuable for children? Are movies valuable for politics? And I think the terms of that value have changed in significant ways. And whereas most scholars, professors, moviegoers have always in some ways recognized some version of value, production values, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what this project offers is a way of saying, well, there in this day and age, and I think it really is this day and age, that we can sort of shift the terms in really, really important ways that are in many ways more important than production values, political values, economic values. And that will be good. That will be good.
Well, thank you so much, Timothy, for talking with us today and for the wonderful work you did as the disciplinary chair of Cinema and Media Studies.
Well, thank you, James. It has been a pleasure, a transformative pleasure.
Fantastic. And thank you for joining us as well as we spoke with Timothy Corrigan about connections between human flourishing and cinema and media studies. We hope you'll join us again as we continue these discussions, exploring connections between the arts, humanities, and well-being.